Hello, everybody, and welcome to my third lecture in a series 100 Years of Russian Art. Today, I would like to talk about the artwork that was happening in the 70s through the early 1990s. And we'll talk about conceptual art, Sots art, or Russian pop art as it came to be known, and what was happening in artistic practices around the time of Perestroika. In this presentation, I'll be talking about the final years of the Communist Party rule in the Soviet Union. Perestroika was a political movement for reformation within the Communist Party during the 1980s. It's widely associated with the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and his glasnost, meaning openness policy reform. This time around, I would like to discuss political art, or an artistic practice that deals directly with political issues. So far, we have been talking about non-official artists like Shemyakin and Anatoly Zverev, but I wouldn't say that their work was political. They were just trying to exercise their artistic freedom and create things that were out of the norm with the artists' union. In the 1970s and 80s, we're starting to see a lot of art that directly tackles some of the political issues of the time. Most of the artists that I will be talking about were considered to be underground artists that started to get wide attention within the United States once this idea of glasnost and perestroika were introduced by Gorbachev. I would like to start by talking about an artist by the name of Ilya Kabakov. This is an image that I showed you last time, briefly, but I would like to go a little more in depth and talk about what this artist's practice was all about. Ilya was born in 1933, and in the 1970s and 80s, he was a central figure in the unofficial Moscow conceptualism movement. Throughout his career, Kabakov has produced a wide range of paintings, drawings, installations, and theoretical texts. Unlike most of the underground Soviet artists that we've talked about, Kabakov joined the Artists' Union in 1959 and became a full member in 1962. Of course, this was a privilege. This was a prestigious position in the USSR, as I've mentioned before, and it brought with it substantial material benefits. In general, Kabakov illustrated children's books for 3 to 6 months out of the year, and then spent the remainder of his time on his own projects. So he was lucky not to be commissioned to paint Lenin or Stalin. His official job was illustrating children's books. As a book illustrator and an official artist, he was able to produce his private artworks in his official studio. Between 1953 and 1955, Kabakov began making his first unofficial works, which he called Drawings for Myself, for obvious reasons. When you make an unofficial drawings, you don't expect a wide audience to see it. Many unofficial artists that we have already discussed would do children's book illustrations as a source of income. So on the right in this image, you see one of Kabakov's unofficial surreal drawings, and on the left you see one of the covers for the children's book that he has created. And this is a piece that he created in 1984, probably the piece that he is mostly known for, and it's called The Man Who Flew into Space from His Apartment. So in this piece, Kabakov creates a room for his imaginary character. And as you can see, this character is obsessed with Soviet ideals and Soviet propaganda. So you see the walls are plastered with posters of Lenin, posters of this bright future that the Communist Party was trying to promote. And this person gets so obsessed with it that he actually creates a device that will allow him to jump straight from his room straight into space. Of course, the Soviet regime was very interested in conquering new territories like space, and they would advance their technological abilities to do so. In this piece, Kabakov ridicules this idea of Soviet propaganda and Soviet ideals. And this is a perfect example of a conceptual art or a conceptual installation. Quick definition: conceptual art is an art form in which the idea or a concept behind the work is more important than the finished art project itself. It emerged as an art movement in the 1960s, and the term usually refers to art made between mid 1960s to mid 1970s. It was widely practiced in America and in Europe. In Russia, this was very much an unofficial art movement, and it was really never embraced by the Artists' Union when it was in its heyday. But Ilya Kabakov was very much a conceptual artist. So, one of the concepts that he returned to many times in his work is this idea of a communal apartment and the life within the communal apartment. Communal apartments became very popular in the Soviet Union as a response to the housing crisis in the urban areas. Authorities presented them as the product of the new collective vision of the future. Usually between 2 and 7 families or more shared a communal apartment. Each family had its own room, which often served as the living room, dining room, and bedroom for the entire family. All the residents of the entire apartment shared the use of hallways, kitchen, bathroom, and telephone, if there was a telephone. The communal apartment became the predominant form of housing in the USSR for generations, and some of those apartments actually still exist. This idea of a communal apartment is, in a way, a symbol of the great communist idea. Everybody lives in one commune, they share things like kitchen items, and ideally they live in total peace and harmony. Of course, that was not always the case. And that's what Kabakov started to examine in his work. So, this piece, there is a grater, a very common kitchen item, and there is a bit of a conversation going on between two people who would meet in a communal apartment. On the left, Olga Ilyinishna is asking, "Whose grater is this?" And on the right, Anna Petrovna replies, "Olgi Makarovna." So, typical, mundane, communal kitchen conversation that Kabakov takes and elevates to the work of art. Here's another one from this series where Kabakov reflects the realities of the time. It's a teacup, a very utilitarian teacup that was very popular in the Soviet Union. It was cheap to get, and every kitchen would have one. So on the left, Ekaterina Lvovna is asking, "Whose teacup is this?" And on the right, Fyodor Sergeyevich replies, "I don't know." So Kabakov decides not to paint or draw this mundane scene. As we have seen with previous examples from other artists, he decides to exhibit the actual object. And this type of art is also called an installation. This is another perfect example of a conceptual art installation piece, and it was created in 1989. It's called Incident in the Corridor Near the Kitchen. The clutter of pots and pans represent the endless confusion and bickering caused by the cramped communal living. So here, once again, Kabakov ridicules the notion and emphasizes the chaos that might occur in this situation. The large oil paintings on the wall are of natural scenery. They might represent windows, either real or imaginary, windows into something peaceful, windows into perhaps more of a brighter future, despite of all the chaos that happens around it. So this is a very chaotic, very surreal scene. Of course, this is not what a communal kitchen actually looked like, but Kabakov here captures this notion of what it might feel like when you have 5 different families trying to cook dinner all at the same time at this cramped kitchen, and they're fighting over whose pots and pans are those. In 1989, Kabakov starts to collaborate with his wife. At this point, Ilya and Emilia Kabakov are considered to be among the leading world-renowned conceptual artists. with exhibitions all over the world. You can also see their work in major museums and galleries. Following Mikhail Shemyakin's 1995 show, Ilya Kabakov had one of the first major solo exhibitions of a living Russian artist at the New State Hermitage Museum. That happened in 2004. And in 2017, the Tate Modern in London exhibited works by Ilya and Emilia. And what you see in this image is an announcement for an exhibition of Ilya and Emilia's work that happened very recently in Berlin at the Museum of Architectural Drawing at the end of 2019 through the beginning of 2020. Another conceptual artist from Moscow, a friend of Ilya Kabakov, is Eric Bulatov. He was also born in 1933, and he's also from Moscow. Just like Kabakov, Bulatov uses the iconic propaganda images of the Soviet Union in his work. He juxtaposes Soviet symbols with elements of everyday life, taking inspiration from the propaganda posters. So I'm going to take a quick detour and show you a few of those posters that Bulgakov and Kabakov were inspired by. This is a poster from a Stalinist era, "Glory to the workers of Stalinist railroads." That's the main slogan that you see here on this red banner. So, Soviet regime was very much concerned with building a bright and better future, and that involved creating a powerful infrastructure of railroads, urban housing, factories, farms, etc. Many of the Soviet posters were created to highlight and inspire this. So, Eric Bulatov takes some elements from those posters and uses that in his paintings. So the typography that he is using here is something that you might see on a Soviet poster, but it is a painting, and he plays with this idea of the symbol of a Soviet railroad being one of the key infrastructure elements, and he juxtaposes that with words, and the words here say poyezd, or a rail train. This is another one of his pieces with a similar composition, and this one is a painting of a peaceful cityscape, and the words translate as "I live and I see." So in his paintings, Eric Bulatov plays with this juxtaposition, this notion of like a peaceful, non-political landscape and something which is very political. So in this case, instead of the sun, he puts the main symbol of USSR, the crest of the Soviet Union. So here the letters read Slava KPSS, or "Glory to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union." Those types of slogans were plastered all over the place in the urban surrounding. The idea here is that you would see this not in an urban surrounding, not in a city, not on top of a building, not on a banner, but in a gallery. So conceptual art of the 1970s and 80s play with this idea of Soviet iconography, sometimes in a surreal, chaotic, iconic, or whimsical way. And there was quite a bit of inspiration for this. The urban landscape was filled with images and sculptures of Lenin, or slogans glorifying the Communist Party. And many artists used this imagery in their work, of course giving it a whole different perspective, ridiculing it, or sometimes just very openly making fun of it. Two artists in particular really embraced this approach in their work, Vitaly Kamar and Alex Milamid. In the beginning of the 1970s, Kamar and Milamid began to thematize in their work this strange Soviet mixture of avant-garde, utopianism, and academic tradition. They called their artistic practices a combination of a social realism that we've talked about in the first lecture and American pop art. This approach became known as, the term that was coined here was Sots art. So a combination of something which was very Soviet and in combination with something that was very Western. This is a piece from a series titled Nostalgic Socialist Realism. So you can see there's Stalin here, There is Hitler kind of giving a little hush hush sign, and then we see the character from E.T. Extraterrestrial. Vitaly and Alex use themselves in their work quite a bit. So here they're depicting themselves as young pioneers, kind of trumpeting and saluting this bright future or the figure of Stalin. And this is a piece which is particularly striking, also from this series. It's an image of Stalin, but the way he is depicted goes against all norms of social realism. First of all, he's depicting here praying. And as we've talked about before, any type of religion was outlawed in the Soviet Union. And the leader would never be seen praying. And in this case, Vitaly and Alex depict just that. Here's another piece by Kamar and Melamid, and here the little girl is holding the head of Joseph Stalin. Notice in the background we see a variation of this Malevich's black square that we started our series of lectures with. So this piece includes many symbols. A young girl holding a head of Stalin, Malevich's black square, this red Soviet background, the social realist technique that the artists are using here. And it's very much up to the viewer to make up their mind about what this piece is about. Some people see it as pure humor, some people see it as irony, and some people, especially in the early 80s when this was created, would see this as a very offensive piece. Because Stalin, as the great hero of the Soviet Union, should not be depicted like this. But that is exactly what starts to happen in the 1980s, especially with Glasnost and Perestroika. We see more and more artists taking this idea of Soviet heroes and ridiculing them. This is a piece by Leonid Sokov called Meeting of Lenin and Giacometti that was created in 1989. On the left, you see this very typical sculpture of Lenin, and on the right, you see a piece by a famous Italian artist, Giacometti. So Sokov is showing this contrast here between two completely different approaches in art. One more realistic, and the other one is more abstract and more expressive. Alexander Kosolapov goes on to create a series of works that puts the Soviet symbols in direct contact with American symbols. So here you see a combination of Coca-Cola and Lenin. So here he plays with the notion and the idea of merging two brands together. And in this piece, Kosolapov puts the head of Mickey Mouse right on the body of Vladimir Lenin. So some of this art was considered to be very outrageous. However, this was already being created under the regime of Mikhail Gorbachev. And more and more of those types of things were starting to emerge and be shown to the public. Grisha Bruskin is another very notable artist from this time period. His work also deals with Soviet symbols. This painting sold at the Sotheby's auction in the 1988 for a record price for a work of Russian conceptual artists. I believe it sold for $416,000, an unheard of amount. And what it really demonstrates is that the West was very much interested in what is happening in Russia at the time and how did the artist react to the communist regime. So this is a detail of Grisha Bruskin's work that you just saw. What he's doing here is he's classifying the members of the Soviet society, and he examines their roles. So you see a worker here, you see a schoolgirl, you see a general. Also notice that the general on the bottom left is holding a Soviet crest and an American crest. So again, this idea of combination and juxtaposition of the two brands. Note the way Bruskin paints his subjects, how he paints the people in his paintings. Think back to the first lecture that I've done and the examples of Soviet socialist art that I was showing you. In that case, the people were shown to be very much alive, very much looking into the bright future. Grisha Bruskin depicts them almost as zombies with those eyelids, the eyes are focusing on one point somewhere in the future. Do they have personality? Do they not have personalities? They almost feel like aliens. But they have their individual roles to play in the society of the time. So, also, he was trying to kind of summarize and make sense of what this Soviet socialist regime was all about. Grisha Bruskin also went on to create little figurines and sculptures depicting his subjects. And he now lives in New York and continues to create sculptures, but at this point working with other themes besides the theme of a Soviet reality. So let's put all this in the context of the time. Why are we all of a sudden seeing this free expression and a variety of themes that the artists are working with? And why is it really becoming popular in the Soviet Union as well as in the rest of the world? So far, we've been talking about conceptual art, or Sots art as it came to be known, from the 1970s and 80s. Remember that the 1970s were still under Brezhnev's rule. Brezhnev died in 1982. So in the 70s and early 80s, for example, Erik Bulatov and Ilya Kabakov were not able to show their work to a wide audience. And then the last Soviet leader comes to power, Mikhail Gorbachev. That happened in 1985. And he introduces Glasnost and Perestroika. Glasnost was taken to mean increased openness and transparency in government institutions and activities in the Soviet Union. Glasnost reflected the commitment of Gorbachev administration to allow Soviet citizens to discuss publicly the problems of their system and potential solutions, without the fear of being punished or persecuted. So during the Gorbachev years, the work that we have been talking about starts to come to the surface. Also, the Soviet public is now more exposed to what's happening in the West. So the 1980s in the Soviet Union is a time of great change of mentality and, of course, the cultural life. Just like with Khrushchev's thaw, once a little window of artistic freedom opens up, lots of artists embrace it and take advantage of this freedom. And we're not only talking about visual artists. So let's talk about other aspects of cultural life. For example, rock music. Of course, in the Soviet Union, it was very much an unofficial genre. You were not able to go to a record store and buy albums by the Beatles or Rolling Stones. Those were smuggled into Russia in the 1970s. And if you were caught smuggling those records, you could get jail time for bringing that into the Soviet Union. So in the 1970s and early 80s, just like with visual art, rock music remained underground. This is an image of the iconic Russian singer-songwriter Boris Grebenshchikov and his band Aquarium. And what you see here is an example of a typical house concert. Remember last lecture I mentioned that the way artists, visual artists, shared their work with each other was by setting up apartment exhibitions. Well, in the music world, it was very much the same. By the mid 1980s, under the rule of Gorbachev, some of those musicians are allowed to perform in public spaces. And rock clubs are starting to form in major cities of the Soviet Union where the fans can gather and hear the newly formed Russian rock bands. And there are a lot of them that start to emerge at the time. Another rock band, which was very much in the underground but started to gain popularity in the mid 80s, was Alisa. And here in this picture on the right, you see the leader of the band, Konstantin Kinchev. They wrote and performed songs that became anthems of sorts for a new generation. And those songs would spread very fast in the underground scene. One of those songs was titled My Generation, and this is a quick translation of the main chorus. My generation remains silent. My generation is afraid to sing. My generation feels the pain but continues to get lynched. So, this is a very rough translation of it, but you get the idea. Those musicians were also very much concerned with reflecting this reality and the reality that they were brought up with. And just like with visual artists, since under Glasnost and Perestroika, Gorbachev called for people to debate and bring the issues to the surface, those bands started to get some recognition. And of course, the Soviet youth are starting to get their own rock heroes, the rebels to look up to, if you will. Viktor Tsoi is probably the most prominent example. He started to perform in the early 80s and was very much underground. He performed in apartment concerts just to a few friends and like minded musicians. Within just a few years, him and his band Kino gain a huge following within the country, and he becomes a true idol for many. He embodies this image of a lone rebel and writes some brilliant songs. He also starts to act in films, gaining an even wider audience. And towards the end of the 1980s, the band is also allowed to tour abroad. In the 1990, Tsoi and his band played to a crowd of some 80,000 people in Luzhniki Stadium. And that's the biggest sports arena in Russia. Tsoi himself becomes a symbol of this rise from the underground and the major shift in artistic life. People are really starting to embrace this art form that is free of political control or any type of socialist agenda. Sadly, Viktor Tsoi died tragically in a car accident not long after that concert, the image of which I just showed you. He died in the summer of 1990 at the age of 28. In the center of Moscow, there is a wall dedicated to him where his fans often gather to pay respect, bring flowers, and sing his songs that are at this point legendary. And as a matter of fact, if you attend any Russian party where there is a guitar present, chances are that someone will play one of Viktor's songs. All right, so I don't want to sidetrack here from our main topic, which is visual art. I can talk about Soviet underground rock music for a very long time. It's truly a fascinating phenomenon, something that I'm a huge fan of. I think what was happening in the 1980s and early 90s was the period of some amazing experiments and earning for freedom and creation. But that might be another series of lectures, perhaps. The point that I'm trying to make here is that this underground, unofficial cultural life in the Soviet Union that we have been talking about finally becomes embraced towards the end of the Soviet regime. And this applies to visual art, to music, to literature, poetry, theater, what have you. Now, of course, it is recognized as a major part of Russian history of the last century. And this brings us to the collapse of the Soviet Union in the fall of 1991. The symbols of communism are being dismantled and a new era begins in Russia. It's the end of the Socialist Party, the end of the totalitarian regime, and the beginning of Russian democracy. This freedom that the artists were striving for is finally here. Of course, things were not simple in the coming years, and most of the 90s were spent in a state of chaos and adjusting to the new ways. It's ironic that many artists and musicians that I talk to refer to the Soviet times as an extremely fruitful and artistic period, in some respects more so than the period after that, when they finally achieved the freedom to do whatever they wanted. And this is a great topic for a discussion and something that I'd like to talk to you guys about following this lecture. I would also be happy to talk about what is happening in the artistic world in Russia at the moment. There is a very active art and music scene there now, quite different from what we have been talking about in those lectures since we're in a bit of a different era and time. but there are new obstacles and new problems for artists to deal with. So we will continue. At this point, I want to thank you for listening to my lectures, and I want to leave you with one of the songs by Viktor Tsoi that was featured at the end of an iconic film from the late 1980s called Asa. This song was recorded towards the later part of Tsoi's career when he was starting to get a wide recognition and emerging from the underground. The song is about this desire and yearning for change, be it political or personal, that can be open to interpretation. Take care, and we'll talk soon.
Сигареты в руках, чай на столе, так замыкается круг. И вдруг нам становится страшно что-то менять. Перемен требуют наши сердца. Перемен требуют наши глаза. В нашем смехе и в наших слезах и в пульсации вен. Перемен, мы ждем перемен. Перемен требуют наши сердца. Перемен требуют наши глаза. В нашем смехе и в наших слезах